Good evening, and welcome to the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas. My name is Ella Rooms, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student organization of the Institute. I have held many roles at the Institute, this year serving as the Programs and Digital Content Coordinator. I was also awarded the Elizabeth Dole Public Service Award for 2025. We appreciate you joining us for the Elizabeth Dole Women in Leadership Lecture. Before we begin, there are a few reminders I'd like to take a moment to share with you. Following tonight's program, a video recording will be available to stream on demand on our YouTube channel, where you can access a full catalog of our past programming. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. The Institute also has a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. Please take a moment to familiarize yourself with the marked exits in the room. In the event of an emergency, please make your way to the nearest marked exit. Please follow the instructions of staff members and exit the building if necessary. Following tonight's discussion, a limited number of audience questions will be answered. If you are a part of our virtual audience, you can submit your questions via email at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute aims to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Finally, I'd like to remind you to please silence your cell phones or place them in Do Not Disturb. Now, please join me in welcoming Senior Associate Director, Dr. Barbara Ballard.
Good evening, and happy Kansas Day. Thank you, Ella, very much. I will say again, thank you for joining us in recognizing the leadership of Colleen Shogan at the 8th Elizabeth Dole Women in Leadership Lecture. We're especially honored to be hosting Dr. Shogan on Kansas Day as we celebrate our state's 165th birthday. Tonight's program is presented in partnership with the University of Kansas Libraries and the Watkins Museum of History. This is also the first program of our America at 250 series, which features local programs and exhibits that celebrate our nation's milestone. A special thank you to the Watkins Museum for their collaboration here. This lecture series is named in honor of former United States Senator Elizabeth Hanford Dole, and recognizes her long-lasting career in public service, one of the most storied in American politics and public service. Over nearly half a century, she reached positions of leadership and broke barriers once thought impassable. She served as Commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission. She became the first woman to serve as Secretary of Transportation. She served as Secretary of Labor in the following administration, becoming the first woman to serve as a cabinet position over 2 different administrations. She served as president of the American Red Cross, becoming the first woman to do so since Clara Barton founded the organization. She became the first woman to represent her home state of North Carolina in the United States Senate. And after leaving office, she founded the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, one of the first philanthropic organizations dedicated to supporting our nation's military and veterans caregivers. This lecture series honors her commitment to public service by featuring women who, like her, break barriers, make significant contributions to their field, and reach positions of leadership. Dr. Shogan joins us tonight to share her leadership experience in the nation's leading record-breaking and historical stewardship organizations, and in creating an opportunity for commemoration and reflection during our nation's 250th anniversary. Now it is my privilege to introduce our guest this evening, Dr. Colleen Shogan. Dr. Shogan served as the 11th Archivist of the United States, becoming the first woman in American history to be appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate to lead the National Archives and Records Administration. While at the National Archives, she led initiatives to broaden access to its holdings and enhance its services, both in person and online. with the goal of cultivating public participation and strengthening our nation's democracy. Whew. Ladies and gentlemen, you are in for a treat. Please join me in welcoming Dole Institute Director Audrey Coleman and our guest for the 2026 Elizabeth Dole Women in Leadership Lecture. And give her a round of applause, Dr. Colleen Shogan.
Thank you, Ella and Barbara, for that wonderful introduction. Colleen, it's such a pleasure to have you here to help us celebrate Kansas Day and for this wonderful occasion.
Happy Kansas Day. I'm honored to be here.
I think you're an honorary Kansan by now.
I
This
think
is the time to be
I'm
here.
excited. Yes.
A sunflower. Well, before we start our conversation, I did want to share with a message from Senator Elizabeth herself on this occasion. Senator Elizabeth says, "I'm pleased to welcome Colleen Shogan, the first woman to serve as Archivist of the United States, to the Dole Institute. Colleen's decades of nonpartisan service, including the White House Historical Association, the Library of Congress, and National Archives, have been devoted to ensuring these critical public resources are made available for civic engagement and education. Service to country forms the bedrock of our nation, and I want to encourage all young people who pursue this important path, whatever their professional interest, as Dr. Shogan has done. With my heartfelt thanks to all those in the audience who support the important work of the Dole Institute. Elizabeth Hanford Dole."
It actually kind of gives chills up my spine because, I have such high regard for both, of course, Senator Dole and Senator Elizabeth Dole, for both of them and their lives of public service, but particularly Elizabeth Dole, because I think I was in my 20s when Elizabeth Dole ran for president of the United States, and I remember watching it, and it was so amazing to be able to see someone take that on and become the first, woman to run a fully formed campaign for president of the United States, and she's had such a terrific career in public service, and I'm just so honored to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I'm going to take you down a little bit of a notch because, Colleen, you may be the first woman former Archivist of the United States to be here on the stage, but we've actually hosted a former Archivist of the United States before, our own Governor John Carlin several years ago. You have gotten to know Governor Carlin a bit over the course of your career.
He, whenever I was nominated to be the Archivist of the United States, he reached out to me almost immediately and was very kind, and offered me a lot of words of encouragement. And then I think he was going to make a trip to Washington, D.C., and I was working at the White House Historical Association at the time, and he asked whether he could see me. And so I certainly made time, and he came up to my office, and I think we spent like an hour and a half to almost 2 hours in my office talking about his time as archivist and how much he enjoyed it. And he gave me a lot of political advice, and it was tremendous. And he continued to stay in touch with me after I was confirmed for the position and served as archivist. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're certainly a tight-knit cohort, it would seem.
That's right.
Very good. Well, before we get too far, we have a lot of topics to cover this evening, but I want to be sure we begin at the beginning and lay some groundwork. Most of us are familiar with our nation's libraries, museums, heard about historians, curators, and allied professions, but we're talking about archives tonight, and in particularly, archives have a very specific role against all this landscape, and NARA has a very specific mission apart from all of libraries and museums in general. So can you tell us a little bit about the mission of NARA and the role of an archivist in our federal government?
Well, the National Archives, how many people have been to the National Archives in Washington, D.C.? How many people have been to a National Archives facility anywhere? That would include a presidential library, right? There's archives, there's many archival facilities in Kansas City and the caves. So we actually have a very high concentration of National Archives facilities right in this area, Missouri and Kansas. So the National Archives and Records Administration preserves, protects, and shares our nation's records. And if you go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., you might go there to see the founding documents. That's what, over a million visitors a year come to Washington, D.C. to see the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. My office, when I worked in Washington, D.C., when I wasn't traveling around the United States, was right around the corner from the Rotunda. But a lot of people don't know that in addition to those very important founding documents, there are 13.5 billion records in the National Archives, not just in that building. And like I said, we have a distributed system all across the United States for the National Archives, but 13.5 billion records. It's amazing. It is for sure the largest governmental archive, the largest public governmental archive in the world. And the National Archives, alongside, I always say, the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian Institution, they typically, people view them as comprising the three institutions that preserve our nation's history and share our cultural heritage. And the Archives does that through records. And there are two types of records at the National Archives. One is a federal record, and the vast majority of that 13.5 billion records are federal records. And those are records produced in the execution of any governmental duty in any of the agencies or departments in the federal government, or received by those agencies or departments. And the other type of record are presidential records, and those are records produced in the execution of the office of President of the United States. And collectively, between federal records and presidential records, the National Archives helps tell the story of the United States, the decisions that were made by public officials, when constituents have petitioned their government, in some cases legislative records, limited legislative records at the National Archives. It's really our record of how we tell American history at the archives.
And it's not all just old stuff, right? I mean, you have new records.
Oh, there's new
right?
records
I mean,
coming in all the time.
This is coming in all the time, so it's
all the
active
time.
service, and so it's not just for historical or cultural purposes.
No.
It's for like very practical.
There's a lot of practical purposes. So probably the most relevant practical purpose at the National Archives are veterans records, which are housed in St. Louis, Missouri at the National Personnel Records Center. I went there several times as Archivist of the United States. And it's very important, obviously, for veterans to have access to their military service records so they could claim benefits that are due to them. Families sometimes want access to records for burial purposes. And families are interested in the service that their grandparent or an ancestor has performed. And that is a very practical reason to have access to the records because laws are changing all the time. And sometimes you need access to your complete military record to be able to show you were in a particular place, you served at a particular place or location at a particular moment in time, and then you would qualify for additional benefits or services. So it was a part of the job, access to veterans records, that I took very seriously. When I came on board at the National Archives, it was after COVID, and there had at one point in time amassed a 600,000 request backlog for veterans records. When I came on, I believe it was around 400,000. They'd already worked to get that backlog down a little bit, but it was the biggest problem that I faced as archivist, and it was the first place that I went. Only about a week after I was confirmed for the job, I said, get me on a plane to St. Louis as soon as you can make my federal travel and you can get me situated to go, because I wanted to see the operation in St. Louis and work with the leadership there and the team there to figure out how we could improve efficiencies. What could we do to draw down that backlog as quickly as possible? And there were some challenges that we faced to be able to do that. But I'm really happy to say that the following year, less than a year in calendar time, we eliminated that entire backlog, all 400,000. And it was because of the hard work of the people at NPRC. They worked overtime, they worked shifts on the weekends. They came in every opportunity possible to remove and reduce that backlog. So I'd like to tell that story because a lot of times people can be negative about federal employees, about what the bureaucracy, or the sprawl in Washington D.C. This happened to be federal employees in St. Louis, not in Washington D.C. But that doesn't really ring 100% true with me because I actually saw the opposite in action. Federal employees, a lot of them who were veterans themselves, who really were very much dedicated to the idea that they had a big task ahead in front of them, and if they didn't clear that backlog, that people could actually, lose access to benefits. They were preventing people from families from being able to bury mothers, fathers, grandparents, and they took it seriously.
So, you're talking about a case where the records are for individuals, but you also mentioned that the National Archives, houses the records, documents the processes of our legislature, of our federal agencies. What does access to that kind of thing mean when we have a democracy and self-governance?
Well, it's really important. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why records are important, and we can think of real practical reasons like I just talked about. We can think about, if anybody has ever read a book by a popular historian like a David McCullough or Doug Brinkley or Doris Kearns Goodwin, chances are that book was written that book was written in part because of access to records at the National Archives. But in addition to sharing our nation's history in things like movies or books, also, it's just important for the day-to-day operations of a democracy because records provide us with accountability for the actions that people take in federal agencies, whether that's the Secretary of Defense or the head of a federal agency or someone else who is a federal employee that is, working to support those operations. And if we don't have access to those records, then we don't have transparency in our government. If we don't have transparency, we can't have accountability. And without accountability, we really have no legitimacy in a democracy. So, record keeping sounds like sort of like an administrative task or something like that you might do. But in actuality, it is a building block of democracy. It is essential for the United States, a large democratic republic, because if we don't have that accountability, then our government is of the people, by the people, right, to quote Abraham Lincoln. And if we don't have the ability to understand those decisions and either hold people accountable or understand why they made those decisions, then we're not talking about government based on of the people, by the people.
Is our system of National Archives, is that unique to the United States, or is that typical around democracies around the world?
Oh, no, it's typical. We're actually a little bit late to the game. The National Archives was created in the 1930s. The building was started under Coolidge. The plans for the building started under Coolidge. The building broke ground under Hoover, finished under FDR. So right around that era, around the post-Depression New Deal eras when the National Archives came online, there were big problems. I mean, there were records all over the place, and they were sitting in government agencies not being taken care of. And so the idea was we have to create a National Archives, and other democracies had already started, particularly European counterparts had already started creating archives of that size and magnitude. So I visited a number of archives around the United States. I visited archives in Ireland, I visited archives in Canada, and I visited the archives in the UK. And very similar, of course, the United States, our archives are bigger, and we have more records to preserve and provide access to, but same type of principles in other developed democracies.
Can we talk a little bit about your path to this position, and starting out when you were a young person, what did you ever envision that you would be in a leadership role like this when you were?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I will say this. I mean, it was probably a little bit, weird. I always kind of liked politics. I mean, I'm a political scientist. I'm not a historian. I'm not an archivist by training or a librarian. But I always kind of liked politics and liked being around and in politics, which is really strange because my parents had nothing to do with politics. I wasn't from a political family or anything like that. And I also really enjoyed history. My dad liked history, and I grew up in southwestern Pennsylvania, right outside of Pittsburgh. And when we would go on family vacations, which usually wasn't that far from Pennsylvania, wherever we could drive, if we went to Hershey, PA, which is kind of a lot of fun for kids to go to Hershey, PA, for obvious reasons, amusement park, candy, all that. Then we would also go to Gettysburg, right? My dad said, okay, we're going to go to Hershey, but we're going to go to Gettysburg as well. If we went to Virginia Beach, we also went to Yorktown and learned something about history, and I think that was really important because then history to me wasn't just something, of course you have to learn about it by reading about it, but if you go and visit some of these places and you engage with it firsthand, then it becomes alive to you because it actually becomes tangible. And it's something that you can remember and think of as a firsthand experience. So I didn't become a historian. I went to college. I went to Boston College, and I love studying political science. So I went and got a PhD in political science, and after I finished my PhD, I went to George Mason University, which I got a tenure-track job at George Mason to teach American politics, which in Fairfax, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. And I thought, gosh, I mean, it was as a R1 university right outside of D.C. I mean, I really felt like I hit the jackpot, and I did. It was a great place to start my career, and I thought I'd probably be there for the rest of my life. Maybe I'll do different jobs at George Mason, different positions, but this is probably where I will be for the next, 30 to 40 years. And I think I would have done that, except I started teaching students at George Mason, graduate and undergraduate students, who not only wanted to study politics, they actually did politics. I mean, or government service. They interned at the White House. They interned at various departments and agencies. And I had a really great academic background, but I had never really taken a lot of time off to work in government or to work in a nonprofit or to work in politics. So in political science profession, the American Political Science Association has this great one-year fellowship called the Congressional Fellowship Program. And I decided to apply for the fellowship. So I would take 1 year off at George Mason and go to work on Capitol Hill, work either in the Senate or the House, and get some real-world political legislative experience, and then come back to George Mason, and it can inform my teaching, it can inform my research, and it would kind of solve that problem that I felt like I was having a little bit in the classroom. And I got the fellowship, really excited, and I went to Capitol Hill, and I just never came back. I just never came back. I went to work in the Senate. After that, full time. Then I went to work at the Library of Congress for over a decade at both the Congressional Research Service and then in senior leadership at the Library of Congress. And then from there, I went to the White House Historical Association and was a senior vice president and ran the David Rubenstein Center, which is the research and history center at White House Historical. So, I'm so glad. I really love George Mason. I still go back and teach. I'm in academia, and I teach one course a year at Georgetown. But once I got caught with that public service bug, I could never go back full time because I love the idea of having that efficacy behind what I was doing, behind what I was researching, what I was thinking about. It was so real to me that I could actually make a difference in people's lives. I really felt it, and just a transition point in my career.
So how did these experiences prepare you not just to be the Archivist of the United States, but for a politically charged and contentious nomination process.
Yeah, it was, I mean, it was interesting because, like I said, I'm a political scientist, and I'm a political scientist, even though I wrote my dissertation on the presidency, my second institution that I spent a lot of time on, that I've also done a lot of research on, was Congress. And then, of course, I spent a lot of time with Congress when I worked at the Congressional Research Service. When I worked in the Senate, I worked for Joe Lieberman in the Senate, and I was his rep on a number of committees in the Senate, so I worked a lot of nominations when I was his legislative assistant in various guises, so I understood the nomination process from the other side of the dais, right? You know, as a staff member assisting a senator. And so when, you know, a couple of times when I was sitting there in that chair and things were happening, there was like two voices inside of me. Like one was Colleen Shogan, the nominee, like, okay, I have to. And then there was this other little voice that was like, wow, this is really interesting. Like this is, you know, this is, they're asking you this question because of this, that. I had my like staffer hat on the other side, the other ear. So it was kind of a surreal experience, but thank goodness that I had such a background both studying politics and having been in politics, and I had spent a lot of time in and off of the Hill. So when I was caught in a contentious nomination process, not anything of really my own doing, I understood how to navigate that. And I understood how to work with the White House, who was very supportive. They have a whole nominations team. And understood when I went into, you know, various offices in the Senate, what I had to do to be able to make sure that my nomination would be, my confirmation would be successful after I was nominated. But thank goodness I had that background, because if they had just thrown someone in there that didn't have any political experience, I think it would have been very difficult, very challenging.
You talked about some of the things you accomplished regarding access to veterans records and things like that. But when you got in the position, did you have some goals in mind, things that you knew you wanted to accomplish?
I think there were two problems that presented itself besides the veterans record backlog, which was, I would say, like a discrete problem. It was a challenging problem, but it was one, once we got it moving, and I got weekly reports on it, and I kept my eye on it, I knew that we were going to get there because we had very good leaders at the National Personnel Record Center, and there was a lot of people that were making sure that we were going to be successful. But there were two other big challenges at the National Archives. The first one was that the National Archives is an agency that really suffers from not enough funding, not enough resources. And I had worked at the Library of Congress for many years. I understood their budget. I had led the federal budgeting and appropriations team at the Congressional Research Service, and I had actually even worked on appropriations for Senator Lieberman. So when I looked at the budget, even when I was the nominee, I had some concerns because I knew what the budget was at the Library of Congress, and just from understanding as the nominee how complex the National Archives system was, I knew that it could not be enough money. It's not half, but about 60% of the budget of the Library of Congress. Now, the Library of Congress, an amazing institution. It is mostly 3 buildings on Capitol Hill, mostly 3 buildings on Capitol Hill. They have a few other locations across the United States, but that's the vast majority of the Library of Congress. National Archives, 40 facilities all across the United States, including the presidential library system from Herbert Hoover forward. And you only have 60% of the budget of what the Library of Congress has, and you have 13.5 billion records that you're trying to take care of. I thought, okay, this is probably going to be an issue. And I was in the job for 2 or 3 months, and I realized, oh yes, this is a big concern, because a lot of the ideas that I had, I realized we didn't have the funding to be able to do it. So, you know, luckily, understanding the process, we really had to go to work. How were we going to try to help solve this problem? And I knew the director of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, which is the budget office for the president, and it's situated outside of the White House, but is the president's budgeting arm for the whole federal government. I'd known her because she worked on the Hill for years, and she had worked as a senior staffer in the Appropriations Committee, and I went over to see her luckily she took a meeting from me and went over to talk to her and explained the problem to her. And between the two of us, we figured out, what we needed to do to put the National Archives on a better path for sustained budgeting. And that's what I went to work. But then that was good to have her support, but she's just, the president's budget officer, really needed to get the support of Congress to be able to do that. So I went to work on Capitol Hill and had to go and to try to persuade as many members of Congress and senators as possible, bipartisan, both Republicans and Democrats, about why we needed to responsibly and incrementally increase the National Archives budget to make sure that we would be able to preserve these records and provide access to them. Because the second problem, which was related to the first problem, was that we had 13.5 billion analog records at the National Archives, of which only a small number have been digitized that are available on the catalog. Probably now, over 400 million rather are digitized and available online, which is a huge number, but it's not 13.5 billion. But that is a mere drop in the bucket. That's not what kept me up at night, was digitizing the rest of the 13.5 billion. It was the billion and then eventually trillions of born digital records that were going to be coming the National Archives' way in the next, let's just say, the next decade. Because it's one thing to produce a paper record like a memo or a photograph, but imagine how many photographs digital photographs are taken now in federal agencies. How many emails are produced? Those are all federal records, right? And between 1% to 3% of them become permanent National Archives records. So I knew that amount of data, those amount of born digital records were coming to the National Archives as those record schedules started to play out in the next 10 to 20 years. And there was not a system. There was not a digital archiving system at the National Archives to handle that huge amount of data and records and information. Not the system to allow the transfer of those records, not a system to allow archivists to work with the records in a digital space, and not a application to enable access to those records for Americans. So all three steps in the process, there were components that had been built, but the whole system hadn't been built, and it certainly didn't talk to each other, any of those components. And when I understood that hadn't been done, and that was what was facing me, that is certainly what kept me up at night, because if we don't get that right, if we don't do that, eventually at some point in time, Americans will not have access to our nation's records the way that they do in analog format to go to a National Archives facility and request access to those records. So those are the two things that I really became focused on as much as possible as long-term problems that the National Archives had to solve.
Mm-hmm. So in your advocacy on the Hill, were folks sympathetic, responsive? How would you characterize it?
Nobody ever that I ever met with, from the most conservative Republican to the most liberal Democrat, nobody ever said to me, "Oh, we don't need the National Archives," or "This isn't, this isn't a legitimate ask," or that dismissed me in any way. No one ever did that, and I spoke to people, like I said, from the entire range of the spectrum in both the House and all the way to the Senate. Now, it's a challenging environment. It's a challenging political environment, and certainly in federal appropriations is challenging. So it wasn't like they said, "Oh yeah, we'll give you whatever you want, thanks for coming." I mean, it wasn't like that easy.
Good thing you asked.
But that wasn't that easy. But what you have to do, and I knew this intrinsically, is that you have to start to build a coalition right on Capitol Hill. You're not going to get all 541 between the House and the Senate to be excited about this. But you need a dedicated group of a small number of people in the House and also in the Senate that will be your patrons, that will be your supporters, that will carry this through. And I was also being, I think, very reasonable about my asks. We're just looking for about $25 or $30 million a year for the next 10 years. You don't have to give it to me all at once. You don't have to give me this big chunk all at once. Let's build the budget responsibly over time, incrementally, so that we can start to improve the systems incrementally at the National Archives, so that at the end of a decade, we will see an entire transformation. it was good because at the Library of Congress had the exact same problem. That I saw people deal with when I was a senior leader at LOC, to rebuild their technology systems, their access systems, and they did the same thing. They went to Congress, made the case, and incrementally, over a period of several years, were able to make improvements. So I thought, well, okay, I've seen that playbook. I saw a lot of success with that at the Library of Congress. I can essentially imitate that playbook and make those same arguments for the National Archives, and that's certainly what I was trying to do.
In 2005, something interesting happened. President Joe Biden said in a statement that he believes that the Equal Rights Amendment has cleared all necessary hurdles to be formally added to the Constitution as the 28th Amendment, and that's following recent years of ratification by some other states. And as the archivist, your position is to publish those amendments if they come through the process correctly. Remind us what happened and what the outcome was.
Well, this was an issue throughout my entire time as archivist, and also when I was the nominee. I certainly understood the issue before I became the nominee because the White House made me aware of it. This was under President Biden. I thought, well, I'm going to understand the Equal Rights Amendment issue, because if I'm going to accept this nomination and go through the process, as it was stated, I would become the first woman to serve as Archivist of the United States. I knew, I understood politics. I was going to be under a lot of pressure to publish the ERA. So you need 38 states, to ratify any amendment to the Constitution. It's a high bar, 3/4. And when the ERA initially went through, there was not enough states. Then the ERA's deadline was extended to 1982, and no more states actually ratified. So it kind of stopped at 35 states in 1982, and that expiration for the ratification deadline expired in 1982. But then states later on, more recently, 3 states took the ERA up again and ratified the ERA in state legislatures, arguing that the ratification deadline was not constitutional, that you cannot place a ratification deadline on an amendment. And so then under my predecessor, David Ferriero, this happened not under me, but under my predecessor. And so there was a court case that went forward about whether or not the archivist could publish the amendment. Was it true that ratification deadlines are not constitutional? And the district court, the federal court, decided no, that the archivist could not publish the amendment because ratification deadlines are indeed constitutional. They can be included in an amendment and had to be enforced. And then, of course, was appealed, and it went to the appellate level, the circuit court level, and that was reaffirmed at the circuit court level. And that's the situation where we found ourselves in. And so I was asked, many times in my nomination hearing what I would do, and I said, well, we have Office of Legal Counsel opinion from the Department of Justice who says the archivist cannot publish the amendment, and you have now 2 court decisions that reaffirmed this DOJ, this Department of Justice legal opinion. So unless Congress acts in some other way to change the ratification deadline, and the courts would decide that that was legal for Congress to act, then I could not publish the amendment. So I was very clear. I was asked this question 85 different ways in my nomination, to get me on the record. And I was comfortable with that because I understood, even though I'm not a lawyer, I understood the rationale behind that. And of course, there were 2 court decisions that had, at both the district and the appellate level. But then, politics changes. Politics always changes. Things are never, politics isn't a static business. It's a dynamic business. And President Biden, at the end of his time in office in 2025, had been persuaded by some arguments from the American Bar Association and some other individuals saying that actually he did not agree with those court decisions, that the ERA had achieved the required states for ratification. He did not order me to publish the amendment, but he expressed his opinion that that the ERA, he thought, was part of the Constitution. But, I stood by as, someone who took an oath of office. I didn't take an oath of office to any politician, any given president, any member of Congress. But when you take a federal oath of office, as I did, it's to the Constitution of the United States. And I felt like I had to uphold the processes and procedures of the Constitution, including how to amend the Constitution of the United States. So I came under enormous political pressure, not necessarily from the president, but from a number of people on social media and in real and also in person to publish the amendment. It had nothing to do with my own opinions of the Equal Rights Amendment. Zero about my personal opinions about the ERA. But as Archivist of the United States, it wasn't my job to impose my own personal opinion. I was there to do a job, and the job is one that is independent and nonpartisan. So I was not deterred. I'm proud of what I did. I think the ERA should be part of the Constitution, but it has to be done in the way that will make it a permanent part of the Constitution that stands up, of course, to judicial interpretations.
So that and the other challenges that you described are just, you covered, you had to address a vast array of challenges during your tenure as archivist, but in the end, your tenure was relatively short.
Comparatively to other archivists.
Yeah. So how did your time in office conclude?
Yes, I was the first woman ever to serve as Archivist of the United States, and unfortunately, I was the first archivist ever to be removed by a sitting president, and was removed, as many people were, by a social media tweet or public posting on social media, and unfortunately, that's really how my senior staff found out about my removal. It was Friday night, and I was actually reading a book, a novel, and I was trying to relax. It was like 7 o'clock at night, and one of my senior staff called me on the phone and said that he had seen this social media post, and then I looked at my phone, and there was an email from the White House saying that President Trump had removed me from office and thanked me for my service. So that was the end of my tenure. I was unfortunately never provided with any explanation by the White House or by anyone else about why I was removed. In the statute, the National Archives statute that details the duties of the Archivist of the United States, both the procedures for nomination and selection for the role of archivist. It says that if the president does have the power to remove the archivist, but if he or she does so, that the president must notify in writing to Congress the reasons for such removal. And those reasons for removal were never communicated to Congress. I had a number of friends in Congress, in the Senate and the House, and they did make inquiries to the White House to ask why. Why was Colleen Shogan removed from this position? We have not received written notification in Congress or on any of the committees of jurisdiction, and none of their inquiries were ever responded to. So people ask me, why were you removed? And I have to say that the answer is, I do not know.
What do you hope your legacy is as a former archivist of the United States?
Right. I mean, a legacy, of course, I'm so proud of my service as the first woman for the job, because when you work in the field of archives, libraries, museums, numerically, there are more women who work in that field in the United States than men. It's a profession dominated by women. But until maybe 10, 15 years ago, we didn't see a lot of women in leadership posts in archives and libraries and museums, and the big archives, libraries, and museums across the country, big public libraries across the United States. And of course, Carla Hayden became the first African American to serve as Librarian of Congress, but she was also the first woman to serve as librarian. And when I would see her out and about and at public events, and particularly public events where there were a lot of librarians in attendance, like a librarians conference, the American Library Association, I was always so struck by the fact of how many women would stand in line. I mean, would stood in line for well over an hour in order to take a picture with Dr. Hayden and shake her hand. And sometimes women would be crying, I mean, as librarians, because it meant so much to them that they got to meet the first woman to ever serve as librarian of the United States. And then I became, I mean, just, the first woman to serve as archivist. And when I would go to events, particularly where there were women in the archival field or women in the library science field or related fields, they would do the same thing. They would line up, and they were so emotionally moved by the fact that I was there. I'm so happy that I was able to do that. And I can say with confidence that even though I was the first woman to serve as Archivist of the United States, I will not be the last woman to serve as Archivist of the United States. And there will be a long tradition, I am sure, in American history of women who will occupy that role after me. But I mean, as far as my legacy at the National Archives, besides that, which I'm very proud of, I really stood for trying to find ways in which we could, creative ways in which we could share and promote access to the records, because these records are they're not the property of the National Archives. The National Archives holds those records in trust for the American people. Those records belong to you. They belong to the citizens of the United States. And we have to employ archivists that make sure they preserve and protect those records so they can be used for generations to come. But we need to make people aware of the fact that the National Archives exists and that you should come and learn about our shared history and use the records, whether it's online or in person, and use them as a citizen, as a curious, interested citizen. And I'm such a strong believer in that transmission of public history in the United States. I was so happy to be a spokesperson for those records and for our shared history. And quite frankly, I figured out, it took me a little bit after I was fired from the job, but not too long. I figured out I can still do that. I mean, I'm not the Archivist of the United States, but I can still do all of those things that I love doing as Archivist of the United States. I can continue to advocate, obviously, for the National Archives, continue to advocate for the preservation and sharing of records, and of course, continue to advocate for American history.
So 2026 is a milestone in our nation's history, and really world history, as we recognize the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. I think most of us are aware online or in the world in general that historical conversations are also kind of a national battleground. What do you think is, from your perspective, what is a way that, is there an opportunity here for us to come together as Americans as we talk about our heritage, our narrative? How do you talk about, this idea of, the less flattering aspects of our history and integrating that into a larger American story?
Right. Well, we have to be honest about American history. We can't just celebrate the successes in American history. Of course, we certainly can do that, but we can't only do that. And one of the ways that I've started to explain this to people, which it seems to resonate when I talk about it, is that if we only understand the successes of American history, we really can't understand them if we don't understand the failures that preceded those successes. Because believe me, there were a lot of failures that happened before we got things right, or we expanded rights in ways that we all would support today. Those were hard-fought battles in the United States for the expansion of those rights, the fulfillment of the promises of the Declaration of Independence. So, we can't have American history one way or the other. It has to be both, because that is an accurate depiction of American history. And we want to be accurate in how we think about American history before we even start to interpret it. So we have to take the good parts of our history along with the periods that are difficult components of history. I wear a necklace tonight. I was the vice chair of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, and this is a depiction of a pin that Alice Paul, the suffragist, it's actually a picture of a jailhouse door because, well over 100 suffragists were imprisoned trying to advocate for women's right to vote, for the 19th Amendment. And anytime a suffragist was imprisoned for protesting or advocating for that cause, Alice Paul, who was a leading suffragist, who was leading on the side of advocacy and protest, particularly in Washington, D.C., in front of the White House, she gave them one of these pins to wear with pride. I always remember that because we celebrate, for example, the 19th Amendment. We celebrate women's participation in politics. We shouldn't forget the 80 years that it took to get to that point in 1920, and all of the times when they were told no, when suffragists, they were failures in that social movement, paths that they went down that turned out were not fruitful for them. And they were resilient. They always figured out a new way. They had another path, another strategy. And how do we appreciate that story, that tremendous story of 1920, if we don't understand the full history that preceded it? And that goes for all aspects of American history.
You have a new project that is about to debut in a few weeks on President's Day, right? As you talk about the fun things you get to do post service. Would you tell us about what's coming down the pipe?
It was a great joy. I had only left the archives, a short, maybe month after I had left the archives, and an organization called More Perfect contacted me. It's run by a terrific public servant. His name is John Bridgeland, and he worked in the George W. Bush administration. And he contacted me and said, we have this project in which we've raised some support, some funds for. And the idea came to being from all the presidential foundations and presidential sites across the country, which are part of the More Perfect Alliance. They want to do something really great for 2026. And the idea is to get prominent Americans to write short essays about all of our presidents and select first ladies. And by the way, we also have Anita McBride, who was the former chief of staff for Laura Bush. She's going to help with the project. She's a co-chair, and Mark Updegrove, who is the CEO of the LBJ Library and Foundation in Austin, Texas. He's another co-chair. And I knew both Anita and Mark from all my different jobs in Washington, D.C., and knew they were tremendous people to work with. And John Bridgeland said, why don't you come and do this? I said, well, I was going to take a little vacation. I thought maybe I'd take a little break. This has been a little stressful these past couple of years. And he said, well, think about it. And I thought about it, and I could sit at home and think about all the challenges and problems that the United States has and the state of not just the United States, but the state of the world. Or I could get back in the game, and I knew 2026 was right around the corner. I was so excited about celebrating the 250th anniversary of the United States, and this seemed like a great project in which to do it. So I said, okay, I'll come on board and let's do this thing together. And I went to work at around the end of March, and we just started building this project and building it out and recruiting between 3 or 4 of us, all the people that we knew that might want to write these short essays about presidents and select first ladies. And Diana Carlin's in the audience, and she's one of our great scholars who's writing about a first lady, about Jane Pierce. And we wanted to put together a project that would have a lot of impact in 2026. So we asked former presidents, we asked former first ladies if they would write essays. We asked the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts. We asked Pulitzer Prize winning historians and journalists. And They all said yes. They all said yes, we want to do it because this project is not going to be ideological in any way. We want to bring as many Americans as possible together to read these essays, listen to the essays if you don't want to read. We're going to have audio recordings of the essays, have a podcast, have short educational videos for kids. And let's learn the lessons of American history through our presidents and first ladies. Let's learn those lessons of American history together as Americans. And can this bring us together? So we're going to launch on President's Day. And President Bush is writing our first essay for In Pursuit. He's writing the essay on George Washington. We have a terrific historian from Brown University. Karen Wolf is writing the essay on Martha Washington. They will both release on President's Day, which is February 16th. And then we will publish those essays chronologically, weekly, till December of 2026. And you can go on our website, inpursuit.org, and you can sign up. Just give us your email, and you will get those essays dropped in your inbox free of charge. There's no firewalls, no cost to it. President Obama is writing the essay on Abraham Lincoln, and President Clinton is writing the essay on Teddy Roosevelt, and Laura Bush on her fellow Texan, Lady Bird Johnson, Michelle Obama on Jackie Kennedy, and Hillary Clinton is writing the essay on Eleanor Roosevelt. And of course, Chief Justice Roberts is writing on William Howard Taft, the only president of the United States who also served as the Chief Justice of the United States. So we have, and then all a cadre of 60 other scholars, journalists, very recognizable names from all across the political spectrum are participating in this project, and I think it's going to be great. I don't think I can solve all the problems that we have here in the United States. I'm not that naive. But if we all kind of work together in a civic spirit, and I do my In Pursuit project and you do your projects here in Kansas, if we all kind of work together, then I think we can come out the other side of 2026 a stronger country for it.
Thank you. And I will mention that those of you who are big fans of the Dole Institute will recognize this name. Richard Norton Smith is our founding director.
Yes.
He is also a contributor.
On Gerald Ford, yes.
Yeah. So I have one quick question for Colleen, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience. So students with microphones, I hope you're ready. There's one. Okay, great. So Colleen, I just wanted to ask you as we close, you mentioned the challenges that face our country, and what advice would you give to young people considering public service, or why should they get involved in public service, or where's their opportunity to contribute?
I think there's a lot of opportunities to contribute. There's opportunities certainly in all levels of government. Doesn't have to be just the federal government. You have state government, you have local government. Get involved. There's great nonprofit organizations here in Kansas, but civics organizations nationally that are looking for creative young people in which to join the ranks. And it's, find your niche, find what you like to do, what you love to do, and if you find that that goal or that area that you really are comfortable in, you really won't feel like you're working. And really, I never feel like I'm exactly working because I enjoy what I do so much. And be willing to be flexible in your career. My career has taken so many different twists and turns. I mean, all the way from a faculty member at George Mason teaching American politics to be the Archivist of the United States. And then I would never have imagined that after leaving that job that I would then come to be running a history-based civics project that involved 3 former presidents and 3 former first ladies that is, I think, going to really make an impact in 2026. But you have to have a degree of patience with yourself and self-confidence, and you also have to be resilient. I think resilience is really the key civic virtue that we have to have. And all people, not just young people, need to have that. So when you're faced with setbacks, and it could be setbacks in your own personal life, your own personal career trajectory, or it could be for a cause that you're working for. You see setbacks, step back, acknowledge the setback that you're facing, and take a moment to acknowledge that. But then try to figure out a way around it. Try to figure out a way that you can build back better, and what is your next path forward. And when that path becomes apparent to you, you'll know it, and get back on the horse and start to ride. I mean, I really want to encourage that message of resilience, and don't be defeated, for sure. Be optimistic about the future of the United States. I certainly am.
Thank you, Colleen. All right, audience, I know you've got lots of smart people, smart, curious people out there, and you've got lots of questions. So go ahead and raise your hand. A student will come to you with a microphone. Stand if you're able. A student will hold the microphone. And please be brief with your questions so we can get in as many as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I wonder if you could share your thoughts on the Freedom Plane.
Oh yeah, the Freedom. Yeah, I wasn't involved with the Freedom Plane because that project was launched after I left the National Archives. It's a project to put some of the nation's founding documents, not the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, which never leave the National Archives, but other noteworthy documents of and records of that era, and to take them, I believe, to 7 different cities across the United States and put them on display. So I think that's great, because as much as we can get the records out, and have people have eyeballs on them and experience what it's like to see a document of that age and that degree of importance, once again, that's like bringing history to life for Americans, and not all Americans. And the thing that I like about something where people get to experience the documents firsthand is that not everybody can come to Washington, D.C. Like, it's just not like everybody can get on a plane and travel to Washington, D.C. That's why I'm an advocate for digitization of documents, so you can experience those documents firsthand online. If you have an iPad or a tablet, you can zoom in, you can really see the detail, because a lot of the digital scans are such high quality. But I think it's terrific so that people can learn more about the National Archives in places that don't necessarily have National Archives facilities.
Thank you. Had another question over here.
Oh, all right. Thank you. I feel like I should start by saying thank you for your service.
Oh, thank you.
And also thank you for reminding us of the kind of dedication that so many federal employees have in working for us, the people of the United States. But what I want to know is if circumstances made it possible and you were nominated again to be the archivist, is that something you would be interested in doing, or has your have you kind of set your sights somewhere else?
I mean, I take every day as it comes. So, every day is a new day. And, I will say this, and I was talking with another individual who served, not at the National Archives, but served as the head of another important federal agency. And we were having a conversation, and I said, do you think you have another run in you? This individual and I are about the same age. And I said to him, do you think you have another run in you? And he said, yeah, I think I have one other run in me. And I said, I think I do too. And so, yeah, I mean, whether it would be in that role or another role, for sure. I mean, if the call comes again, I would want to serve my country in any way that I was deemed suitable to do so.
Other questions up here at the front? Okay, we'll take right there.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I think Elizabeth and Robert Dole would be very pleased that an assistant to Joe Lieberman is here in Kansas.
They would. Both like Joe
sharing the message of bipartisanship. Question, I have here, my wife is reading one of the 6 mystery novels that you wrote earlier in your life. Can you please share with us to solve the mystery of how your writing mysteries early in your life weaves in your personal narrative in politics?
Wow. What a great question. Thank you so much for that question about my mystery novel writing, which was not something
right
we
over
skipped
that.
over that. I just love reading mystery novels. I mean, I just do. I've read mystery novels, since I was able to read. I mean, I started with, Nancy Drew and Trixie Belden, and I read the Hardy Boys and, Encyclopedia Brown, all of those great books. And my mother was a great reader of mysteries. So then she turned me on to Agatha Christie. And so, I got a little older. I started reading Agatha Christie, and she got Ellery Queen magazine, and she used to like to read the short stories and mysteries. So I really became a mystery reader, I think, because of her. And she loved to read as well. So we would take time in the summer, and we would, she would read her book, and I would read my book. I read mystery novels, even in graduate school. It was a way that I found for relaxation and fun and recreation. So the true story of this is, I was taking a walk one day in my neighborhood, as I sometimes did before work, and I had just finished, I don't know, some mystery novel. I don't know why, but my mind started to wander. I thought, well, if I wrote a mystery novel, what would I write it about? And I said, well, I would write it where there was a Senate staffer that solved mysteries, because wouldn't it be fun to set a mystery in a mystery in the United States Senate, and it'd be a staffer, and maybe somebody, her boss would get murdered, and maybe she would be the suspect, and she'd have to try to solve the mystery to try to clear her name. And I basically, on that walk, came up with the plot of Stabbing in the Senate, which became my first novel. And I even came up with the title, Stabbing in the Senate. Good move. If you ever have an idea like that, you should write it down. I mean, don't trust your memory. So I did. When I got home, I scribbled it down on a piece of paper. And then, a few weeks later, I told my husband about it. I said, I had this really crazy idea about a mystery novel. And he said, you should write that novel. You would be great to write that. I said, well, there's one problem. I've never written any fiction in my entire life. I've never taken a course in writing fiction. He's like, oh, you read all these, novels, you can figure it out. And that's really actually what I did. I had all these novels, sitting on my shelf, and I started to look at the books like critically. Okay, well, what's the structure of the story? When does the crime take place? How many suspects are there? How many clues are there? And I just started, deconstructed a lot of the books that I had read. And then one day, I don't know, I just sat down in front of the computer and I started writing. And, one book turned into 3 books. And then, 3 books turned into 6 books. And then 6 books turned into 8 books. And so I ended up writing 8 mystery novels with the same character, who was a congressional staffer who solved mysteries on Capitol Hill, and then she branched out into Washington, D.C. And it was just such a joy to write those novels. It was a creative side of my brain that I didn't know really existed, and it enabled me actually to tell stories about the good work people were doing in Washington, D.C., and in a way that was not partisan. So I've had people say, I'm a Republican and I liked reading your books, or I'm a Democrat and I like reading your mystery novels. And I'm always so grateful to hear that, because they were written so that everybody can enjoy them.
I think you've just gotten me in trouble in 2 ways. 1, for not bringing that up earlier, and 2, for not having books of yours to sell.
Oh, that's fine. You can find them. They're all, they're online. You can find them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right, we have at least one more question. Let's go up here, and then we'll go to the back. So come on up here. I think, Rick, do you have a question? Maddie, come in.
Thanks. Quick question. So before you left the archives, what was your vision and goals and biggest challenge you thought you saw ahead of you?
Yeah. I mean, really, I thought the biggest challenge really was solving the digital problem. I mean, this digital infrastructure problem, and we started to call it like a system of systems, because we started to do a little research on it and talk to some technologists and consultants that we were going to actually have to build a number of systems that then would have to be interoperable with each other, that would be able to talk to each other, so that whenever we wanted to share digital records in the future, that the process for Americans to gain access to those records would be seamless. And of course, artificial intelligence was coming to the fore, and we knew that we were going to have to figure out a way to work, within closed system AI to be able to make the billions, but then eventually trillions of records searchable. So that was, the biggest long-term problem that I felt that the National Archives faced. And I estimated that it was going to take 5 to 10 years to build that system, to get the funding for it, to get the right people on board, and the right personnel, really, and experts to be able to do it, and then to be able to construct that system, a 5 to 10 year project.
Okay. All right. So back there, Barbara's waving.
The Archives is such an extraordinary institution. Thank you for sharing it, so much about it. In this time of suppression of important information that's not politically advantageous for some groups, how do you see the role of the archives in procuring and protecting information about how the country's doing?
Yes, I mean, there's no replacement for what the National Archives can do, because the records tell the story, right? And the records tell the story not just for our present day, but for decades and generations to come, of people who will look back at this time trying to make sense of how this era, this time frame fits in the long arc of American history. And I take some comfort because records also they are what they are. And say that they don't lie. They can be, of course, they can be biased because people can choose what to include in a record or not to include in a record. But it is an important repository we have. It's a critical repository for our democracy. It's not, like I like to tell members of Congress, the National Archives is not like a nice thing to have. Like, oh, it's a nice place to go, and we can see some old documents and some records. Yes, it's all that, and we use those records to teach kids about American history and all those types of things. But undergirding that is the real reason why we have the National Archives, which is transparency, accountability, and legitimacy of a democracy. And if you cease to make if the National Archives is not funded adequately or it doesn't operate efficiently and effectively, you are, in fact, undermining the very structure of democracy and where it rests. And people they kind of got it. They would pay attention to that argument and understood the importance of it. So, and I have not heard of any, stories in which the people who work at the National Archives, they continue to show up every day, all of the archivists and the archivist technicians, and they are doing the jobs. The records continue, as Audrey said, they continue to come in. Those records will continue to be processed and placed for accessibility for the American people. So, I mean, you still have a dedicated group, cadre of individuals who are working for the American people to preserve our history.
Okay, we had one question up here in the middle. And I see one hand back there. We'll take those two and then we'll conclude.
I guess this would be a follow-up. The current archivist seems to have a lot of extra time on his hands. So how confident are you in our current system?
Right. I mean, I'm not on, Marco Rubio's speed dial, so I've not, he's not called me to confer about the operations of the National Archives. I will say this. Yes, you're correct. He has a number of positions, roles that he's fulfilling right now. I can't really comment on his leadership of the National Archives because I'm not there and to have the information to comment on it. But I will say this. When I was the Archivist of the United States, it was not a 40-hour-a-week job. I never spent 40 hours a week as Archivist of the United States. I greatly exceeded 40 hours a week. And I think I worked every day as the archivist, whether it was answering emails or doing something except maybe for the exception of maybe Thanksgiving and Christmas. I think those days the archives were shut down and nobody was working, and thankfully we didn't have any emergencies on those days. So I think I probably got those days, off to spend with my family. But other than those very limited days, I was always working, always doing something, to respond to something that was going on, or to try to further the mission of the National Archives. And so for me, it was an all-encompassing role and job. It required that time and attention.
Last question there.
I've heard the Declaration of Independence is moved around each day to a different location. Could you comment on that, and how many original copies are there of this?
No, the Declaration is not moved, certainly not. The Declaration, I can't really go into the security procedures that protect the Declaration. That's actually something you sign, sign on oath when you see the structures that protect the Declaration of Independence. So I can't share specifically how it's protected, but it is in encasement in which it's there for on display, and it's not visible to the public 24 hours a day. It is on display for the hours that the National Archives is publicly open, and then a few hours beforehand, because we have things like military commission ceremonies that take place in the rotunda and other dignitaries that come through before the public hours. But it is really in that encasement permanently, and there's no oxygen, in that encasement. It's argon gas, which prevents the degradation of the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. So those documents, particularly the Declaration, is very degraded, but we have such great people who work at the National Archives in conservation with the science that is developed. They have prevented further degradation of the Declaration, so they're able to monitor that over a large swath of time, and they're confident that they have now arrested any further degradation. I will say one other thing that I did as archivist that I'm really proud of. In addition to when you go into the rotunda and you see the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, for 2026, I had decided as archivist, we need to expand the telling of American history. And so I made the decision, 2 separate decisions, to add 2 more documents to the rotunda. And the Emancipation Proclamation will be joining those documents as on permanent display in the rotunda, and the 19th Amendment, of course, which permitted women to vote in the United States. Those 2 documents will be joining our 3 founding documents. It is going on display. I believe it's going to be March of 2026 when the Emancipation Proclamation, the 19th Amendment, will make their appearances, also in cases that will prevent their degradation, any degradation, perfectly conserved at the same quality as the other 3 documents. So if you come to Washington, D.C., please come to, even if you've been to the rotunda before, come again, because then you get to see the expansion and the fulfillment of those principles in the Declaration of Independence, of course, with the Emancipation Proclamation and the 19th Amendment, 2 great stories of the fulfillment of the principles promised to us in the founding documents.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Audrey.
you, Colleen.
Thank you.
Thank you for your service. Thank you for being with us. I have a few invitation reminders, thank yous to give before we wrap up, and then I'm going to kick it back over to you so you can mention your project again. But I want to thank our partners at the KU Libraries and Watkins Museum for their support of this wonderful program. I want to invite you all back to the Dole Institute in 2 weeks. On February 11th, we're going to have our semesterly discussion group series. You hear me? I don't think I'm talking into this very well. We'll have former Kansas State Senator Jeff King together with journalist Mark McCormick. Their series is called Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, and topics on that theme. Their first evening, or their first theme on February 11th at 4 o'clock is entitled, What Does It Mean to Be United? So we hope to see you back here or online for that conversation. And then on President's Day here at the Dole Institute, in partnership with Humanities Kansas and Gilder Lehrman, we'll be opening the Declaration 1776 traveling exhibit, The Big Bang of Modern Democracy. So thanks again for being with us. And Colleen, tell us one more time about your project and what we can look forward to.
It's called In Pursuit, and if you go to inpursuit.org, you can sign up and we will deliver the essays to you on a weekly basis starting on President's Day all throughout 2026. So I hope you'll join us on this journey.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks again, Colleen.